Yes, it's entertaining and certainly very popular. But if Dan Brown's Da Vinci Code is just fiction, then why all the controversy? It's controversial because Dan Brown would have us believe it's fiction, but much more. Fiction that's based upon fact. He believes that there's historical background underlying the entire story of Da Vinci Code. He would have us believe it's like the movie Titanic, in which the love story between Jack and Rose was fictional, but everything else, the ship, how it sank, the tragedy, all that's historical. Similarly, Dan Brown would have us believe that the underlying history about Jesus Christ, about the nature of the New Testament, the Gnostic Gospels, the whole idea of Jesus being married to Mary Magdalene, all these, he believes, are rooted in historical fact. He became a believer. And I think Dan Brown would want the viewers of the movie to become believers as well.
I began as a skeptic. As I started researching Da Vinci Code, I really thought I would disprove a lot of this theory about Mary Magdalene and holy blood and all of that. I became a believer.
There seems to be a lot of speculation about the Bible and the lost chapters, and there are many stories in and around the Bible that are vague to everyday Christians, everyday working people.
What is portrayed in the Da Vinci Code is diametrically opposed to what is said in Scripture.
I'm interested into seeing how the movie makers have integrated all of these bizarre and different ideas of what the relationship was between Jesus Christ and Mary Magdalene.
And so I am concerned that there are a lot of people out there read the book, see the movie, and they can't discern the truth from the error.
I'm a spiritual person. I believe that all religions are somewhat related.
I'm an open-minded person, but when it comes to religion and so forth, I'm Catholic. So I think that show me proof, and then I'll take the word from it.
Dan Brown does provide a very apt critique of modern Christianity, especially modern Protestant Christianity, that it has diminished the concept of the feminine divine.
I don't necessarily think of God as woman or man, but sometimes when I'm praying, I can focus on the goddess figure.
A lot of folks in the culture are searching for spiritual answers.
I am planning to see it. I haven't heard a lot about it, but I heard my friend told me that the book is great, so it's going to cause a lot of controversy, of course.
As you can see, the Da Vinci Code certainly has people talking, and it's by no means a new conversation. In fact, it's a discussion many people were having long before the movie came out. Some of the themes and ideas it presents have actually been part of a cultural discussion even before the book was published in March of 2003. But not only are people talking about it, it's also become the subject of numerous other books, articles, and, yes, documentaries. So what's contained in this one book and the movie adaptation that's generating so much activity? I'm Joe Washington, and I'll be your host as we reveal the answers to that and many other questions surrounding the Da Vinci Code. Before we find out what all the discussion is about, it might be a good idea to first find out what the Da Vinci Code is about.
The Da Vinci Code is a novel. It's a blockbuster. It's an exciting read. It's a chase through Europe, through cathedrals and museums, and running from the police and from would-be assassins, etc., as the couple in the book is trying to discover the truth about what was Da Vinci trying to say in the painting of the Last Supper. Did he have a secret? Did he know something about Jesus Christ that the church has been trying to hide and suppress for centuries.
And so Robert Langdon, the key player, is trying to sort that out, and he encounters a young lady who turns out to be the granddaughter of the murdered man. So between the two of them, they try to solve this mystery. What was the murdered man trying to say by certain things he left around and on his body? Well, it turns out to be he's part of what's called the Priory of Sion, an organization he was a Grand Master of. And this organization, which according to Dan Brown, around since the Middle Ages, had this deep secret that if Christianity were ever to allow it to get out, it would just destroy Christianity. So the church, specifically Roman Catholic Church, kept this organization under so they couldn't reveal this incredible secret, which would, of course, destroy the Christian faith. That's the novel.
No wonder people are talking about this book. It's a page-turner. Many readers have found it to be just that, based on its sales. Shortly after being released, the Da Vinci Code made the New York Times bestseller list and remained there for an amazing 136 consecutive weeks. In its first 3 years of publication, it was translated into 44 languages and sold over 12 million copies in the United States and over 40 million copies worldwide. Without question, the book and the movie are immensely popular, not only in the United States, but in many other parts of the world. But this popularity hasn't come without controversy.
The Da Vinci Code is a challenge to the Christian faith because it combines two elements. One is it's a thriller page-turner. It's an exciting mystery story that takes place fairly quickly and is a good, exciting read as far as that goes, and it is cross-cultural, but at the same time it purports to teach history, to teach truth.
The writer was asked if he were writing nonfiction, if he would change anything. He said he wouldn't. He said he was a believer in the theories that the book puts forth, and that he thought they ought to be in the public square. And so for that reason, it raises issues about the early history of the early church that most Christians don't know about.
And Brown says basically Jesus was a religious leader, like a businessman, if you will, who really concocted the whole scheme, if you will. He's not the Messiah. He's not the Son of God. And so a lot of people eat this up. And we've been hearing for a long time, you know, the Bible's been tampered with, the Bible's been altered, and there's these so-called lost books, and now the Gnostic texts that have the real insight to what Christianity is all about. We've been hearing this in the church from various sectors of the public, from academic circles and the hallowed halls, allegedly of religion and so forth, to John and Joan Q. Public. And so this has really struck a chord with these people and said, aha, I thought there was something fishy about Christianity.
He says that all of the factual data is true. He claims to be telling the truth, and he's doing anything except. And a lot of folks can't know or don't know a lot of the information that he gives is false. So it reminds me of the Old Testament saying about leading a blind man into a ditch. It's completely mean and unfair. And I really, really find this something that is, you know, quite infuriating.
For those who do not have a strong foundation, it causes them to lose whatever vestiges of Christian faith they have. Because the expression I've heard over and over, the question I've been asked ever since my book got out there was, is it true that, and then they'll quote something from Da Vinci Code. Is it true that Jesus had sex with Mary Magdalene? Is it true that Jesus and Mary had a baby? Is it true that Constantine declared Jesus to be divine, or the Council of Nicaea did, and that's when it first happened? Is it true that?
Well, this sounds very much like the beginning of a question that might be posed in the setting of a courtroom. Such a setting would be appropriate because, in a very real way, the Da Vinci Code has placed the Christian church and its long-held beliefs on trial. But what are the charges? Actually, there are many. However, the claims made against the Christian church in the Da Vinci Code could be narrowed to three basic allegations. The first allegation is that the Christian church fabricated the Bible under the direction of the Emperor Constantine during the Council of Nicaea, and then destroyed the real Gospels, the so-called Gnostic Gospels, so there'd be no historical evidence of what had been done. The second allegation concerns the person of Jesus. While Dan Brown does not deny the historical existence of Jesus, his view of Jesus is radically different from that of the Christian church. He claims at that same Council of Nicaea, the church changed its long-held belief that Jesus was just a man, and for the first time proclaimed him to be God. Again, according to Brown, this was done in full cooperation with the wishes of Constantine. And why did Constantine desire such a change? Well, the answer is found in the final allegation against the church. The Da Vinci Code alleges that for centuries the church has lied, not only about the person of Jesus, but also about his mission. According to Brown, the mission of Jesus was to restore the worship of the sacred feminine through marrying Mary Magdalene and placing her as the head of the church. Brown maintains that Constantine and a male-dominated church did away with goddess worship and lied about it in order to establish their own power base by proclaiming Jesus the Messiah. These are certainly intriguing claims, and if true, one might reasonably ask how the church could possibly have done this and deceived so many for such a long period of time. The answer, Brown states, is found in a massive cover-up, one so large that it involves not only the church, but also secret societies and a rewriting of history. But do the facts support these allegations, or will they support the historical beliefs and teachings of the Christian church? Dan Brown has left the decision in your hands. He's presented his argument against the church and placed the case in your hands, the jury. He's quite simply asked that you now find the Christian church guilty on all counts and dismiss it accordingly. However, in order to make an informed and accurate decision, both sides must first be heard. A valid judgment cannot be rendered until all the evidence has been presented and considered. During this presentation, you'll hear scholars from a variety of fields of study, such as theology, history, and art, and such diverse religious backgrounds as Jewish, Roman Catholic, Orthodox, and Protestant, weigh in on the merits of this case. After examining the evidence, will such a diverse panel of experts be able to come to the same conclusions about these allegations? When they take the witness stand, what will their examination reveal? The answer when we come back. On page 231 of the Da Vinci Code, the following statements are made. The Bible is a product of man, my dear, not of God. It has evolved through countless translations, additions, and revisions. History has never had a definitive version of the book. More than 80 Gospels were considered for the New Testament, and yet only a relative few were chosen for inclusion. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John among them. The Bible as we know it today was collated by the pagan Roman Emperor Constantine the Great. Are these statements accurate? What does the evidence say?
It's a total fabrication to say that Constantine wrote a new Bible. We have church fathers well before the time of Constantine, up to 200 years before Constantine, who witnessed to the truth and the reality of all that the New Testament spoke of.
And what's amazing is very independent, spirited people across a couple hundred years, across a fairly wide geographical area, without present-day transportation and communication, came to a commonality that this is of God and is unique.
Whatever was recognized as being inspired had to function internationally. It couldn't be something that was just regionally appreciated, but every book that was let into the canon had to have some kind of a larger universal appeal throughout the Mediterranean world. The church has had various criteria for the measurement of inspiration. One of the first, of course, is that the document must have been authored by an apostle or by the disciple of an apostle. A second criteria was that the document cannot be in contradiction with the Old Testament, belittling the Old Testament in any way, or in contradiction with writings that have previously been accepted in the New Testament. Thirdly, the document, particularly in the age of the Gnostic controversy, any gospel that was accepted had to, in first place, emphasize the real incarnation of God the Son in human flesh and the real authentic death, the real authentic bloody sacrificial death of the incarnate Son of God.
Considering the question of versions and revisions and translations of the Bible, a question of a translation, for example, is a moot point in this whole discussion. It's a red herring. It's a, well, look at this path, and here's a translation that wasn't even a good translation. Look at this, and here's a corrupt one, and even you think this one's corrupt. Those kind of discussions are meaningless because we have papyri. We have the majority of the New Testament from about 100 years after its completion, the Chester Beatty and Bodmer papyri. We have the majority of the New Testament. The papyri is there for anybody to go back and look at. For example, I do a lot of lecturing on the resurrection of Jesus. 1 Corinthians 15 is a key chapter. All 58 verses appear in this early papyri. So let's say somebody goofs up a translation in the 16th century. Let's say somebody messes one up in the 21st century. What do you have? You have a messed up translation. That's what you have. But it doesn't affect the early manuscripts we have. We have the entire New Testament just a century after that. So we have most New Testament from a century after the completion. We have the entire New Testament from a century after that. And later translations are red herrings. It doesn't make any difference what translators say or don't say. We can always get back to the earliest copies.
The central message of the Bible is just joltingly consistent. And so-called disputed texts are over such minor issues where in a copyist moment something could have been left out or added. They're so inconsequential, there is almost nothing to compare. We have, what, 6,500 or so fragments or portions of Scripture? More evidence for Jesus Christ than almost any of the other people that lived at that day and time. So the Bible, not only does the world have a definitive translation, it has multiple defensible translations. There's nothing to compare to it in any kind of modern literature where something has been so well preserved, well studied, viciously attacked as the Bible, which should give every person enormous confidence in what they have in their hand in the Bible.
The books that make up the canon were all written in the first century. On that, everybody is agreed. The process of recognizing those books and treating them as Scripture was a long process. It did expand over several centuries. By the end of the 2nd century, we know that the 4 Gospels were recognized and being used as a collected unit. We also know that the epistles of Paul were functioning the same way. After the end of the 2nd century, those books were not debated. We have quotations from Origen in the early part of the 3rd century who says, we don't read the Gospel of Matthias and the Gospel of Thomas in the churches.
The church gave no consideration to any Gnostic text when it was considering the canon. And there's a reason for that. Gnostic texts, for the most part, came in the 2nd century.
There's a line in the novel where they said that there were about 80, if I remember, Gospels floating around, and the church ignored them and burnt the other ones. There is no data for that kind of thing at all. First of all, there aren't 80 Gospels. But they're very late. They're not in the position to know what's going on, and there's no record of burning sources. In fact, the whole thing kind of smacks of an argument from silence, because the argument goes like this. Well, we have a lot of Gnostic Gospels. Well, not 80, you don't. Well, there were a lot of them, and they were around at this time. What are you doing with them? We're not doing anything with them. Yeah, but didn't you burn them? No, there's no record of that. See, you must have burned them. So it's an argument from silence because there's no record that there were that many or that they were destroyed. Nothing like that.
Nag Hammadi was where they were discovered. Dan Brown says there are 80. They were not. There were 52. He says they were in Aramaic. They were not. They were in Coptic. He says they were in scroll form. They were not. They were in book or codice form. Written during the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th centuries. Who wrote them, we do not know. You look at the Gnostic writings, and they really shouldn't be called even Gnostic Gospels, because only 5 of the 52 are called Gospel, and even those 5 are not Gospel in the way we think of them. They're actually collections of sayings, more like the book of Proverbs, than they are historical narratives at all. But they're profoundly contradictory.
In terms of the dating of the Gospels, one superb test case that recently surfaced is the newly found Gospel of Judas, where some biblical scholars would suggest, this is yet another retelling just as good as Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. To the contrary, what this text does, and what the majority, if not all of the so-called Gnostic Gospels do, is tell us not about Jesus of Nazareth, not about the real Mary Magdalene, but about church debates in the 4th century or even the 3rd century. They tell us about the diversity of Christian thought. They don't tell us about the historicity of Jesus himself.
2 of the most important questions in historiography are who wrote the source and how close is it to the data they record. Well, if there's already one strike against the Gnostic works, because even the earliest one is more than a century after Jesus, most of them are centuries after Jesus, well, that automatically tells you that they are not in the best position to know what Jesus did or what his followers did or what he taught.
If I could use one word over and over again regarding Dan Brown and the Da Vinci Code, it's irony. So often the claims he makes are the exact opposite. He claims, of course, that the church tried to suppress the so-called Gnostic Gospels and other writings. He says there were at least 80 Gospels, and why only the 4 that were included. And the idea is because the church tampered, got rid of, suppressed early on and throughout history has suppressed or tried to literally destroy the competing Gospels. The irony is that that's not true. Historically, the only one who really tried to suppress Christian literature were the pagans. Via Rome, systematically from the top down and from among the people themselves, under Diocletian and other emperors pre-Constantine, before Christianity was legalized, there were systematic persecutions of Christians, and they not only persecuted Christians, killing them, imprisoning them, torturing them, and so forth, but a big part of their campaign was to confiscate all Christian literature. So that would include biblical literature and relevant data or documents related to the Bible that were not actually included in the New Testament. And so the only objective evidence that can be verified of anybody tampering with the Bible or attempting to eradicate literature were the pagans. In fact, the church has never done that, and the idea that somehow the church has been suppressing these documents is just whimsical. It's just fanciful.
Through careful research of the evidence, these scholars have determined that the facts do not support the allegation that Constantine directed the church to destroy the real Gospels, the so-called Gnostic Gospels, and substitute their own fabricated version. But what does the evidence say regarding the second allegation? The answer, coming up. On page 233 of the Da Vinci Code, the following assertions are made about the person of Jesus. Constantine needed to strengthen the new Christian tradition and held a famous ecumenical gathering known as the Council of Nicaea. Until that moment in history, Jesus was viewed by his followers as a mortal prophet, a great and powerful man, but a man nonetheless, a mortal. Jesus' establishment as the Son of God was officially proposed and voted on by the Council of Nicaea, a relatively close vote at that. On the following page, the book adds, because Constantine upgraded Jesus' status almost 4 centuries after Jesus' death, thousands of documents already existed chronicling his life as a mortal man. Again, let us consider the evidence before rendering a decision.
You know, of all of the claims Dan Brown makes in the book, the claims can be small. I mean, he gets even the art wrong in places. Speaking of a massive painting as something that a woman takes off the wall, I've seen the painting, the Madonna of the Rocks. It's huge. It's the size of a door, and it's on wood planks. No woman's going to be taking it off the wall. That's just a little problem. But if you know art, you know how wrong that is. It's so wrong, no one who really loves art can respect anything Dan Brown now says about art. Well, as a theologian, I have to look at Dan Brown's claim that, for instance, the early church didn't believe that Jesus was divine, that this was cooked up in 325 in the 4th century by Constantine and his co-conspirators. I have to look back and say, you know, of all the claims you can make, that one's about as easily debunked as any I could conceive. Number one, you have the biblical Gospels. You have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. You have the preaching of the apostles. You have the book of Acts. You have the writings of the Apostle Paul. No one believes that any of those emerged in any time later than the 1st century. All of them affirm that Jesus was divine. You have clear statements of the divinity of Christ. You have clear statements of the apostolic preaching. There's simply no question about it. We have hymnody. We have sermons. We have prayers of the early church speaking of Jesus as divine. You know, there are some books that can only be explained by their times. And that will be true of Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe. You couldn't explain that book without understanding its placement in 19th century America. You can't understand the Da Vinci Code without understanding America in the secularized world in which we live. Only a world in which so few people know anything about Christianity could a book like this take off and be considered plausible.
I guess what I would say, sometimes I hear an idea that is so ludicrous that I hesitate to even respond to it. There is no historical evidence at all to support this. If Dan Brown would come out and just say, look, folks, chill out. This is a novel. I made the whole stuff up. I made it all up. We'd go, oh, okay. He stands behind this. And he simply is pulling out of thin air from other sources that have pulled out of thin air. And there's no historical veracity at all for what he says when he makes such claims. Constantine did not involve himself in that particular process.
The Council of Nicaea did not meet specifically for the purpose of identifying books of the Bible, but for the purpose of condemning the heresy of Arius. Idea of Jesus being God was not something that was conceptualized at the Council of Nicaea. Jesus himself in the Gospel of John very clearly and succinctly identifies himself as being one with God our Father who is in heaven.
The Bible clearly shows that Jesus is fully God. Fully God in that Jesus performed a function that only God could perform. In the 1st chapter of John, we see that through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. Only God could perform that kind of creation. And we see it repeated also in Colossians. All things were created by him. That would mean that Jesus would have to be God.
Orthodox perspective is that the Son of God is indeed of the same essence as the Father. He is eternal with the Father. He shares the nature of the Father. He shares the substance of the Father. He shares the essence of the Father. He is omnipotent with the Father. He is omnipresent with the Father. He is omniscient with the Father. Everything the Father has in terms of essence, nature, and substance, the Son has. So that we would confess as members of the Orthodox belief community that the Son of God is divine in nature, but at the incarnation, the Son of God also became human in nature. So he is like the Father in his deity, but since the incarnation, he is like us in our humanity, like us in every way, yet without sin.
The early church hammered out very clearly on the issue of the two natures of Christ. Is he divine? Is he human? Is he fully divine or fully human, or somehow less than fully divine or less than fully human? And there's corresponding heresies, whether one's an Ebionite who denied the deity of Jesus Christ, or some type of docetus, from the Greek word dokeo, to seem or to appear to have a body, if you will, did he not have a human nature? And the church clearly held, and the New Testament documents clearly teach, the full humanity and deity of Jesus Christ. So in fact, it's not an either or, it's a both and.
We have abundant evidence, both in the biblical Gospels and in patristic sources prior to Nicaea, that Christians everywhere were teaching the deity of Jesus.
The fact that there were thousands of persons who gave their lives for Jesus, they gave their lives not because he was simply some man, some creation who died upon the cross. People gave their lives because they believed that Jesus was one with God our Father who is in heaven, who rose again from the dead, and through his resurrection corroborated that he is the Son of God who can in fact effectuate salvation.
Anybody with just a cursory knowledge of church history would know that the Council of Nicaea did not debate the divinity of Jesus Christ. It debated and talked and discussed, was the Son co-eternal with the Father? That was the issue at Nicaea. Brown in the book so mispaints Constantine that his own mother wouldn't recognize it.
One of the things that I noticed throughout Dan Brown's book is that there is certainly an anti-Christian agenda, but he especially is anti-Catholic. He'll talk about this conspiracy between Constantine and the Vatican. And Constantine uses the Vatican did this, the Vatican did that. Again, one more part of his being an ignoramus. At the time of Constantine, Vatican Hill was uninhabited. It was a hill surrounded by a swamp. There was nobody living there. The papal headquarters were at the Lateran and St. John Lateran, which was a gift by Constantine to the Pope after the churches had been destroyed by Diocletian, his predecessor. So there was no Vatican that could be in charge of anything. But he says that in order to be anti-Catholic, because now the Vatican is the center of Catholic legislation and power. This is where the Pope resides and his curia, his offices are. So that's why he does that. He doesn't care about the historical facts. He does care to attack Catholicism. And I find this something that's obviously very offensive to me as a Catholic, but something that's of grave concern. The vote, according to Dan Brown, was a very close vote. It was 318-2. Not even in my hometown of Chicago do we count that as a close vote.
The Council at Nicaea overwhelmingly reaffirmed the deity of Jesus Christ.
Well, why did the bishops meet? Now, according to Dan Brown, they met because the Emperor Constantine wanted to gain control of the church in a political victory. And Constantine is the great, great enemy of Dan Brown's conspiracy theory. He's the original unindicted co-conspirator in this great conspiracy. And what he suggested is that the idea of the deity of Christ was actually developed at the Council of Nicaea as a way of redefining Christianity. When the creed, the confession we know as the Nicene Creed, was signed at the end, only 2 bishops didn't sign. I have to look back and say that's when the church stood. That's when Athanasius, the great bishop, stood over against the heretic Arius and said, we're going to have to say the gospel is this and not that. Those who want to say that there was a time when Jesus Christ did not exist, those who want to say that the Son is of a different substance as the Father, those who want to say that the Son was at some point accepted by the Father as Son, but was not born and incarnate as the Son, that those persons are heretics. I'm thankful the church did that. In 325, we should look back and say that's when the church stood. The big question for us now is whether we would have the same courage and the same clarity as those who met in 325 AD.
As with the first allegation, these scholars have determined that the evidence does not support the allegation that, prior to Constantine, the church did not regard Jesus to be God, but thought of him as nothing more than a mortal man. But will this also be true with the final allegation? Will the evidence prove the church innocent of all the charges brought against it in this case? We'll know in a moment. Much of the controversy and discussion surrounding the Da Vinci Code seems to be related to this third allegation. It is, in fact, the heart of the code. Simply stated, it is the belief that Jesus came to restore goddess worship, and in order to truly worship and serve as a priest, it was necessary for him to be married and practicing ritualistic or sacred sex, known as eros gamos. On page 309 of the Da Vinci Code, Brown writes that this was once the traditional practice of the Jews. The author carefully leads the reader to believe that Jesus came to restore this early Jewish tradition of goddess worship. The reader is led to conclude that in order to accomplish this, Jesus must be married. His wife, Brown concludes, is the Holy Grail. Mary Magdalene was the holy vessel. She was the chalice that bore the royal bloodline of Jesus Christ. The Priory of Sion to this day still worships Mary Magdalene as the goddess. The quest for the Holy Grail is literally the quest to kneel before the bones of Mary Magdalene, the journey to pray at the feet of the outcast one, the lost sacred feminine. These are certainly very intriguing claims about Jesus, but did the Jews really practice ritualistic sex in the temple? Did Jesus truly come to restore goddess worship? Was he in fact married to Mary Magdalene? What's the evidence prove?
The idea that the Jews practiced ritualistic sex in the temple would absolutely make every rabbi in the world stand up and scream.
There is reason to believe that the Jews in the Old Testament period may have engaged in some sort of a worship of a feminine aspect of God called the Shekinah.
The term Shekinah, which comes from the Hebrew word shachan, to dwell, that word in that form never appears once in the Bible. It's something that only occurs in very late rabbinic literature. In Solomon's temple were the 10 Commandments and the Ark of the Covenant, including that commandment, thou shalt not commit adultery. And adultery becomes a word used as early as Exodus chapter 34 to refer to worship of other gods and goddesses. Now you do see much legislation that is given to Israel in the Torah against worshiping other gods. Not because it was part of early Israelite worship, but because the Canaanites had a system of this sacred orgies.
There is a history of the idea of ritualized sex, of sexual activity. This concept has been clearly taught and is indeed practiced even today, but it's found in the kingdom of the occult. In some forms of neo-paganism today, for example, some forms of witchcraft, or in some forms of the Wiccan religion, it is practiced. So Dan Brown here only got one thing right, and that is there is a history of this practice, but it's not in the church, it is outside the church. Indeed, it is among occultists.
Sophie saw her grandfather in a circle in a ritual, and there was some spiritual sexual activity going on. In Wicca, we have a ritual to celebrate the mating of the god and goddess or fertility, and some covens will, from what I understand, actually perform the act, and they actually believe that the woman becomes the goddess and the man becomes the god during that act. Now, when I do a ritual, and the rituals I've been to, we don't actually do that. We do have a symbolic way of representing that. And we have a lot of tools that we work with, and the one that represents the god is the athame, which is a two-edged blade knife. And the other one that represents the goddess is a chalice. And so we have a ceremony where the blade is inserted in the chalice, and that represents the mating of the god and goddess. And in the Da Vinci Code, there's the parallel with Mary Magdalene, who was the feminine, who was the Holy Grail, like the chalice.
Sophie Nouveau is being introduced to this whole idea of goddess worship. Professor Lee Teabing carries her into his library and shows her a number of books on his shelf that he says supports the things he's been telling her about Jesus being married to Mary Magdalene and about Jesus restoring the sacred feminine. Some of these books are books like Holy Blood, Holy Grail, The Woman with the Alabaster Jar, and the Templar Revelation. These are, in fact, real books that you can go and buy in the bookstore, and Dan Brown believes that they are nonfiction books, that they actually present the historical record. The authors of Holy Blood, Holy Grail sued the publishers of the Da Vinci Code for infringement on intellectual property rights. During that case, Dan Brown presented testimony, and in his testimony, he stated that he often shared his own beliefs or experiences through the characters in his books. In that same testimony, Dan Brown stated that he had included books such as Holy Blood, Holy Grail, and the Templar Revelation in the Da Vinci Code in order to provide a place for the readers to jump off, as he said, and learn more about the things contained in the Da Vinci Code. Again, he believes that these books are nonfiction and that what they teach, what they say, is true. What did Brown come to believe about Jesus from the Templar Revelation? Perhaps it was a belief that Jesus was an Isian priest who practiced eros gamos with his priestess wife Mary Magdalene in order to restore goddess worship among the Jews.
The goddess Isis was actually remarkably popular in the first century, and she had her own evangelists going out and saying, you ought to worship Isis. But the idea that Jesus of Nazareth, this Jew, was somehow promoting Isis worship makes no sense whatsoever.
The idea that Jesus is trying to introduce goddess worship like these other subjects is totally unfounded. Would it be popular in today's culture if that were true? Oh yeah, it'd be popular. We'd make Jesus in our own image. But do we have any data to make Jesus in our own image? No. No early, no authoritative data, not one stitch of evidence.
There is no good evidence whatsoever that Jesus was married to Mary Magdalene or to any other women. For some reason, biblical scholars and the popular culture gets the idea that all first-century Jewish men were married. And since Jesus was a first-century Jewish man, ergo, he must have been married too. And I can tell you as a Jew myself that the day all Jewish men all do the same thing is the day the Messiah comes, or for the Christian comes back. Not all first-century Jewish men were married. We know this from the Dead Sea Scrolls. We know this from the Jewish philosopher Philo from Alexandria in Egypt, who describes groups of celibate Jewish men as well as celibate Jewish women. Indeed, Jesus in the New Testament itself commends people who leave their wives, that's the Gospel of Luke, commends people who make themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven. That's the Gospel of Matthew. So was Jesus married? To the contrary, he identifies himself as the bridegroom, but he's never the husband.
I don't think Jesus is corrupted somehow if he's married and has children. It's not a problem that we're offended he was married. Nothing like that. The problem is an historiographical problem. We don't have any early sources.
Without question, the central theme of the Da Vinci Code is the worship of the sacred feminine, or goddess worship. Goddess worship is in fact the hidden code. Dan Brown believes that Leonardo da Vinci was a member of a secret society called the Priory of Sion, which worshiped the sacred feminine and protected the secret concerning Mary Magdalene, that she was the Holy Grail. Brown said that da Vinci left codes behind about this, and one of those codes is found in the Last Supper, in which he states it's not John who's seated next to Jesus, but Mary Magdalene.
When it comes to the question of was Mary in Da Vinci's painting of the Last Supper, it's important for us to realize the value of counting. Let's just count how many figures are on that painting. There are 13, 12 apostles and Jesus. If Da Vinci really wanted to project the view that Mary was one of the apostles, why weren't there 14?
We know that Leonardo follows the pattern, the tradition, if you will, of depicting the Last Supper with the primary players, that is, the 12 disciples and Jesus. Now, we know this for two reasons. First of all, we have Leonardo's drawings and notebooks in which he names and writes the names down and characteristics down as he's working them out. We know that when he made this work, it was technically, that is in terms of the color quality, as well as the perspective, as well as his focusing on this particular drama moment of the announcement of the betrayal, understood to be a masterpiece, understood to be innovative. Everyone came to see it. We have reports of many artists who come to see this work, who make copies of this work, who own prints of this work, with everybody's name labeled there. If we looked at earlier depictions, what do we see? Do we see something so startlingly different in Leonardo in terms of the depiction of John? No. We see in earlier depictions John shown without a beard. So if he's the youngest, this is a sign of his age. We know that if we look at the presentation of his body in earlier periods, we will also see a sense of what you and I, with 21st or late 20th century eyes, might refer to as soft, effeminate or feminine body or characteristic. But we see that throughout the history of Christian art. We don't just see that in the work of Leonardo da Vinci. So if we look at Leonardo in the context, and his depiction of this figure of John in context of what's done before him, what's done during his own time, the figure of John does not jut out. The figure of John does not scream female. The figure of John is clearly John's in the tradition. The other reality is people have been looking at that for centuries. If it was so heretical, someone would have caught it.
On subjects like secret societies, and was Da Vinci himself a member, and was the person disciple to his right, was that Mary Magdalene or John? Those kind of questions, when I'm asked those questions, my response goes something like this: and why should I care? Well, what if there was a secret group, and why should I care? Yeah, but don't you care that I don't care what Da Vinci held 1,200 years after Jesus. Now, from what I've seen and studied, you can't make that stick with Da Vinci anyway. But let's just say they're right about Da Vinci and some of these private, secretive societies from the Middle Ages. We are more than 1,000 years from Jesus with some of this. Let's just say, for the sake of the argument, Da Vinci says everything somebody wants him to say. What point does that make?
The entire story of the life and ministry of Jesus is of the one who, as he prayed in his high priestly prayer in John chapter 17, enjoyed perfect fellowship with the Father and accepted the Father's mission, the Father's will, that he would come to earth incarnate in human flesh, and he would die on the cross in order to pay the penalty for our sins. Jesus came to save sinners. His death, burial, and resurrection is the very ground of our salvation. There is not one shred of evidence in any of the four Gospels or in any book of the New Testament that Jesus came for any reason other than to save sinners. That is the central thrust of the Christian church. That's what every branch of the Christian church has affirmed in its own way, going all the way back to the three major branches of Catholicism and the Eastern churches and Protestantism. We have all understood that Jesus came to save sinners. Our disagreements have been about exactly how that was accomplished. But no branch of Christendom, no branch of the Christian church at any time has ever entertained the notion that Jesus came to reestablish paganism.
As with the other allegations, these scholars are in agreement that the facts do not support the allegation. The testimony's been presented, and the case has been put into our hands. We must now carefully weigh the evidence and reach a conclusion. What will be our verdict? Are the allegations the Da Vinci Code makes against the Christian church valid, or does the evidence prove they're groundless? Each of us must decide this for ourselves. Whatever you decide, make sure it's based on the facts. I'm Joe Washington.
I hope you've enjoyed watching Da Vinci Code Revealed. Remember, Watchman Fellowship is here to help you in the area of new religious movements and alternative spirituality. For Watchman Fellowship, this is James Walker.
This is first and foremost a work of fiction, no matter what the first page of the text says in terms of fact. If there's a gift in terms of this text to the general public, it is the gift of opening up questions and reviewing what is reality in terms of history.
In all likelihood, millions and millions of Americans are going to be talking over the next several weeks and months about what Christianity really is, about why Jesus came and who Jesus is. That's our conversation.
The Da Vinci Code will give us one of the best excuses ever to present a thoroughly thoughtful, factual, historical, apologetic for the Bible and its reliability, the deity and divinity of Jesus Christ, His resurrection, His power to save and transform lives.
So every attack on Christianity has ultimately been good for Christianity. And I think this is going to be good for us because it's going to drive a lot of church people who just sit in a pew back to the Word of God and back to some real history.
Most Christians go to movies, and I think this is a movie they might want to see. This movie is going to have everybody talking about Jesus, and I think this is a great opportunity for a Christian to ask a non-Christian, did you see the movie? What do you think about Jesus?
I would say enthusiastically confront what is presented within the Da Vinci Code. This is a wonderful opportunity to present truth that will actually set people free.
I think you've got to ask the question, what do we know from history? And the best way for Christians to respond is to do their homework.
One of the reasons this book became what it became is that we have lost our sense of history, whether we're talking about the history of the church, the history of Christianity, the reading of the scriptures, and people need to recognize that perhaps this is an opportunity to be called back to all of that.
Dan Brown can do anything for us. Perhaps what he might do is encourage folks to go back and see what Matthew has to say, or see what Luke has to say. And there, I think, and I say this as a Jew, there I think you'll find much better news about Jesus and women, about what Jesus can contribute to the world. One does not have to worship the messenger in order to find great glory in the message of the kingdom of heaven. It's a message that I find in the Gospels. It's not one I find in the Da Vinci Code.
But if we're going to be the church, we will have to respond. And we've got to be willing and able and ready to give an answer to the hope that lies within us, and do so in a winsome and compelling and magnetic way.
You know, from time to time, Christians look at a development like the Da Vinci Code and they say, well, we answered that. Well, here's the bad news. These heresies are going to recur again and again and again. In many ways, they are perennial heresies. They arise and they return, and they arise and they return, and they come back in new garb with a new story and new dress. And so we just need to be ready. We need to train our children to be ready for the next line of challenge that comes to the Christian gospel.
The question whether the Christian church is truly prepared for the challenge like the Da Vinci Code remains to be seen.